Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that the right book at the right time can change lives, and that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do here on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature: picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels for readers of all ages. In each episode, we'll talk with children's literature authors and discuss their books, their hopes, their dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. Whether you're an adult reading to their inner child or connecting the young readers in your life with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. So grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back to another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Brian Selznick. Brian is an award-winning author and illustrator whose groundbreaking books have sold millions of copies and have been translated into over 35 languages. He revolutionized storytelling with the invention of Hugo Cabret, a #1 New York Times bestseller that won the Caldecott Medal and was adapted into Martin Scorsese's Oscar-winning film, Hugo. His bestsellers, Wonderstruck and The Marvels, further cemented his reputation as one of publishing's most imaginative storytellers. He's here today to talk about his newest release, a young adult novel titled Run Away With Me, a profoundly romantic novel set in Rome that blends words with pictures for a beautiful, emotional, and immersive experience. It's so powerful, and I can't wait to talk with him about it. So we're going to get right to the episode. Brian, welcome to KidLit Love. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm really happy to be talking to you.
Oh, so I gave a little sneak peek in the overview of your kind of big accomplishments in the field of children's literature, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from you and just give us a bit of background on you and the journey you took to where you are today.
Sure. I'll just start when I was born. I I grew up in New Jersey, and my family was very supportive of me making art. Everyone wanted me to make children's books when I was in high school, and which made me rebel against it.
Mhm.
So I ended up at a very good art school, the Rhode Island School of Design, not wanting to make children's books. And I graduated, came to my senses, realized I should be making children's books, got a job at a children's bookstore, which a friend suggested to me would be a good idea because I didn't know anything about children's books, having not studied it in college. So I was able to read all the books, meet the customers, and I read hundreds, thousands of books while I was at the store. My first book, The Houdini Box, was published while I was there, and that was 34 years ago. And I've been making books ever since. I'm also the author and illustrator of The Invention of Hugo Cabret, as you mentioned, which kind of was, I don't know, I'd been making books for like 15 years at that point. And I suppose that I could say, I'll just add that like just sort of synthesized, tried to use everything I'd learned about making books up to that point when I was making Hugo. And yeah, it's very fun to be entering into the world of young adult literature now.
Yeah. I have, there is a teacher that immediately came to mind, and I sent her a quick email when I knew I was going to get to interview you because she just adores Hugo Cabret and read it every year with her students. It's so powerful. And what I would love to talk about first before we even move into the book is the format. You have the beautiful lyrical language, but then you have those illustrations,
Mm.
you have those pictures, and just together, it's just a very unique reading experience. And I'd love for you to talk about that in general before we move into the specific book we're here to talk about today. But tell us how that came to be, right? And that's kind of the style, so to speak, of your way of writing, and just give us the details into that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. it happened for two, I mean, I can pinpoint like two really important things that happened that caused that book to be become to become. Uh, as I mentioned, I've been making books for 15 years, and I stopped working because I felt like I got stuck. I didn't know what to do next. I felt like I had done a lot of things that I wanted to do, and I couldn't figure out where to go next. And then by total coincidence, in that moment, I met Maurice Sendak, the author and illustrator of Where the Wild Things Are, of course, and so many other brilliant books and so much other incredible work. And he'd always been a very, very important influence on me. And we became friends. And he didn't know my work and asked me to send him a box of my books. And again, I had been making books that had been, for a children's book illustrator, they were relatively successful. I was making my living, with books, and he didn't like any of them. Like he just he said, "Well, you can draw," which isn't true of most illustrators, but none of these books reach the potential I see in you.
Wow.
And that was a very profound moment.
Hmm.
And if I could boil down the advice that came along with that from him, I think it was basically make the book you want to make. Because I had been mostly illustrating other people's books, and he, just felt strongly that I should, write my own work.
Yeah.
And I don't get a lot of ideas for new books, which is why I love illustrating other people's work. Uh, But in the back of my head, I had had one idea for about 14 years that came to me pretty soon after I did the Houdini box in 1991, which is about a kid who gets to meet Houdini, who I loved. And back in 1991, when the book was published, I remember thinking, well, that was fun to make that book. Uh, what about making a book like this about George Méliès, the man who made A Trip to the Moon, which is considered the first science fiction film, and I had seen that movie and loved it when I was young. But I didn't have a plot, I didn't have a character, I just had that idea. And like I said, it sat in the back of my head for 14 years.
Wow.
So when Maurice said to me, make the book you want to make, I literally didn't have any other ideas. And again, by coincidence, not coincidence, I opened the newspaper sometime around that moment, and there was an article called Edison's about a there was an article about a book called Edison's Eve, sort of a book review by Gabby Wood, uh, about the history of automatons, and it talked about how in one chapter, George Méliès, the filmmaker of A Trip to the Moon, had collected automatons, and they were given away at the end of his life and destroyed and thrown away. And I saw in my mind very quickly a boy climbing through this pile of broken machines and trying to fix one of them. That's all I mean, and it felt like a gift. It felt like I just watched that happen. But I didn't know who the boy was or what the story was or why he thought he could fix a broken automaton, which is a very complicated clockwork mechanical figure. And for the next 3 years, I tried to answer those questions. Like what's going on? Who is this kid? What is this story? I knew it was a good idea for a narrative right away. And originally it was so that got the story going. And my original idea was that it was going to be a 98-page novella with one drawing a chapter. And
That
I wrote
changed.
that's what I had my contract for at Scholastic. And I had written almost the entire story, 98 pages. And I just couldn't think of like what one drawing per chapter would be. Like it just didn't feel right. And I do remember having a sense that I wanted I wanted the pictures to feel more vital in some fashion, but I didn't know what that meant. And I don't know exactly how it came together, but at some point I was thinking about Where the Wild Things Are by Mr. Sendak and the Wild Rumpus, where the white space goes away, the words go away, and for three spreads, 6 pages, we just follow Max and the wild things through the forest as they go on their wild rumpus. I thought about books like Fortunately by Remy Charlip, where every time you turn the page, something new happens, which had been an influence on all my work in terms of thinking about the page turns. And then I started thinking about movies. And if you think about like Alfred Hitchcock films and uh, directors who use the camera to help tell the story, where they zoom in on something very important. They edit in a way that helps you move from one moment to the next. And I started thinking, oh, there's interesting connections between the way cinema tells its story and the way books tell their story, right? Illustrated books tell their story. And my story was about the cinema in certain ways. George Méliès made silent films. So I at some point wondered what would happen if I took out all of the text that I could draw and replaced it with sequences of pictures. So in a graphic novel, you often have what looks like a comic book where you turn the page and there's often a square or a rectangle in the upper left-hand corner, and then you move down that page, and then you go to the next page, to the upper right-hand corner of the right page, then you go down until you get to the whatever drawing is on the bottom right-hand corner, and then you turn the page. But I thought, what if every one of those squares or rectangles, like that you see in a graphic novel or a comic book, is an entire full page spread, like one of the drawings in the Wild Rumpus. And I thought, if we love the Wild Rumpus so much and it's 6 pages in a 32-page book, like how exciting would it be to have a 20 to 50-page Wild Rumpus every couple of pages in what turned out to be an almost 600-page book? So I took out all the description from my book because that I could draw. I took out all of the action that I was able to because I could draw that. Like, Hugo runs down the hallway. I didn't have to say that because I could show him running down the hallway. But Hugo runs down the hallway as 5 words in the midst of what would have been hundreds of other words on a spread. But to get the movement, I could either do one drawing of Hugo, which is already 2 full pages. But if I want to get at the verb, the movement, I could draw one picture where he's in the distance, that's 2 pages. Then one where he's a little closer, that's 4 pages. And then one where he's even closer, and that's 6 pages, just for the 5 words of Hugo ran down the hallway. So by the time I got through the whole manuscript and wrote out what I thought all the drawings could be, it had grown to this giant, length. And I had to call my editor, Tracy Mack at Scholastic, and say, so I have this new idea, and it's going to take me a lot longer to make, and it's going to be a lot harder to create. So can we can we renegotiate my whole contract, please? And she loved the idea, and everyone at Scholastic loved it, encouraged me to make it as long as I possibly could. And I did not know if anybody would understand how to read the book. M.T. Anderson, who's a really great author, once said that all books teach you how to read them. So I thought, okay, I will teach my audience how to read this book. So when you open The Invention of Hugo Cabret, there's text first that says, okay, you're going to see this kid. His name is Hugo. You're going to follow him through the train station. You know, go follow him, essentially. So that when you turn the page, there's the train station, there's this kid, that must be Hugo. And then you follow him, but then all this stuff starts happening in the pictures that wasn't in the text. So I'm kind of handing off the idea. And so by the time the book was published, I had discovered that people very quickly understood how to read the book. So when I did my next book, Wonderstruck, I knew I could just start with pictures right away. I didn't need to explain how this would work. So that's my not very short précis on how that happened.
Wasn't short. That's exactly the stuff that we love to know about, kind of the inner workings of it. And from my experience, right now I teach teachers at a university. I teach children's literature, but previously I worked with kids, and I worked with kids in elementary school, and they clamored for the books. They're unique. The format is so unique. It's so immersive. It puts you in the story. And a lot faster than they think. They get through a 500-page book. And that, what that does to just your identity and your self-concept is just I used to see it. I used to get to see it
Yeah.
on their face. And so the format is just beautiful.
Oh, thank
And it
you.
just allows the reader to just be there, to just
Yeah.
really sink in and be there. And with Runaway with Me, you have something similar. You have the pictures in the beginning and you have the illustrations at the end. And I don't know if all readers are like this, and I've lost count, Brian, of how many times I went and started back at the beginning of the picture. So, I first picture by picture before I started any reading. And then I'd read, and then I'd be, okay, wait. And then I go back to the pictures and I look at them again. And then at the end, oh, the end. I did it again. So I've lost count of how many times I have moved through these. It's just that your book is an experience. That is, I think, the best word I can use to capture it. I just
Uh,
loved it. If you couldn't
thank
tell, loved it.
well, well, I think that's the goal, right? Is to create, I think for any writer, whether you draw or not, is to create a world in which your reader feels lost inside of something that is palpable, that is real to them. And, all reading is a collaboration between the person who makes the book and the person who reads the book. And if a book doesn't have pictures, we're all going to, no matter how detailed the description is of a character, we're all going to see different people, which is why film adaptations are often challenging for readers because the actor may not look exactly like what we had in our head. But I can draw. So I can draw what I want everyone to look like pretty much, and I can draw what I want the world to look like, and my drawings are realistic. They're relatively realistic, but they're not like photorealistic. So I think there's still room to ask the audience to project something or to have some form of uh to have some kind of use of the imagination, which is always interesting to me. And because with Hugo I discovered this idea where the narrative continues forward. It's just the words and or the pictures switch off. So they are sometimes the narrative is being moved forward by the text, sometimes it's being moved forward by the pictures. And my goal was that at the end of the book, you wouldn't remember what you had seen and what you had read, that it would all kind of form a single experience like you're describing in your mind. And what I was trying to do with Run Away with Me, which I had originally intended to have no illustrations. I wanted this to be my first book with no pictures, which for me would have been very radical.
Yeah.
But my editor on this book, David Levithan, felt very strongly that we could find a reason to use pictures, because that's always really what's interesting to me. Why is a book illustrated? Why are you using pictures? And Hugo, it was because the book's about cinema. Wonderstruck, the characters are deaf, and deaf culture is a visual culture. So having the one of the stories told entirely through images would parallel the character's deaf experience. I did a book called The Marvels after that, in which the pictures become a kind of memory for the second half of the book, which is all in text, which has some parallels with the structure of Runaway with Me, where it's pictures first and then text second, unlike Wonderstruck and Hugo, where they weave back and forth. And eventually, because I was writing about this city that I loved, Rome, a place that my husband and I lived for 9 months during the pandemic. David got a fellowship at the American Academy of Rome, and we were able to live in Rome at the height of the pandemic in starting in January of 2021. And we had the city to ourselves. Everything was empty. There were no tourists. The Italians weren't going out. I would go to the Sistine Chapel like once a week by myself. And I realized that I could describe these places very clearly in my mind, but if I drew them and had them and created this tour of the city an empty version of the city, even though the book isn't a pandemic book. I wanted to get across the idea of that emptiness, because we think when we think of Rome now, especially, it's such a crowded city, and I wanted to get across that special thing I had where it was ours and it was empty, which seemed like a parallel for and a metaphor for being in love, right? Where everyone else disappears. And I knew I was writing a love story. And I realized that if I create a tour, sort of a walk through this empty version of Rome, it will create a memory in the audience's mind when they get to the text. And I describe the big building called the Pantheon with the dome and the hole in the center. Or you'll remember, oh, I saw a drawing of a big building with a dome and a hole in the center, or the elephant obelisk. And then the reader would have the opportunity to do just what you described, which is if they want to go back and look again at it as they're reading the text. But I think right now, one of the things that's very interesting to me is the use of memory within storytelling and the ways in which pictures can do something interesting for the reader and the narrative when you're asking people to think about, rely on their memories. And I just want to add for any of the listeners who haven't seen the book yet that if it's possible, not to flip ahead to the back of the book to look at what the drawings are at the end until you get there. If you do, it's fine. But I have found that it might be more interesting, moving if you let the pictures reveal themselves at the end. But you can sort of see where the drawings are. When the book is closed, because the drawing sections are dark and the sections without the drawings are light. Um, but I also didn't want to have any drawings at the end because I really liked the last line of the book. But David Levithan again thought that there would be reason for there to be drawings. And we spent some time thinking about what that might be. And we were having dinner when we came up with this idea. David had an initial thought. I sort of shifted it slightly. And when we hit on what I ended up drawing, we both started crying. So I thought, okay, I think that must be a good sign.
Yes. Yes. Tears, tears also. I cried a lot of things, but this book and this is a perfect time maybe to give a few details of the plot and what actually happens in the book. Um, you have what you already mentioned, just this beautiful love story. You have this exploration of a city that feels like it is theirs. And the way that that comes together, first with the pictures in the front, but then at the end, it is just a beautiful experience from beginning to end. Um, with with tears, yes, with smiles, with all of the things. And so I think it's time. Let's give them a little taste of specifically what the book is about and kind of mention some of those details so they can wrap their head around the experience they're in for. And I
Yeah.
agree. Don't look at the pictures in the back until the end. No peeking.
So it's a story about an American boy, 16 years old, named Danny, who is in Rome for 10 weeks over a summer with his mom. She's an academic. Her specialty is antique books and bad handwriting, which is an actual field, paleography, and looking at old and deciphering old handwriting. A mysterious book has been uncovered at this institution where she studied when she was getting her PhD. So Danny had actually been there when he was a baby, though he doesn't remember having been there when his mom was studying. But it's this institution that is called the Manda Museum, and it's based on a real place in Rome, the Museum of Book Pathology, which is dedicated to saving old books, which I visited a long time ago. It was closed during the pandemic, but I had visited it a long time ago and was always remembered it. And so she, this old book was found, behind a hidden panel in the museum, and she's there trying to decipher what the handwriting says. So that leaves Danny by himself most of the days that they're there. And he's wandering around the city. He's very lonely. He's very kind of insecure. He feels I don't know. I guess I would describe him as feeling pretty invisible in certain ways. And towards the start of the book, he meets this other boy, an Italian boy named Angelo, who is extremely weird. He says he doesn't have a name at first. He says he's almost 3,000 years old, the same age as Rome itself, during which time he's been dying like Rome, but never dies. And they form this there's just this attraction, this immediate attraction. And the word queer, the word gay never is mentioned. When I was writing the book, I very much, the two things I knew was I didn't want there to be any violence, and I didn't want there to be a coming out scene, because those were certain tropes that I've seen which exist because they're real serious issues. But sometimes, you can experience your youth without violence, and the coming out scene could be something, maybe it could be something else. So, but I wanted to acknowledge that the world is dangerous. Rome at that time was particularly dangerous. The AIDS crisis was just beginning. So those are all part of the landscape in which these boys exist. And then woven into that are three other queer love stories from history, one from the 1940s, one from the 1900, and one from the 1600s. And I was very conscious about wanting to look at the idea that even when queer people are not accepted, even when they're actively, targeted, or if they're simply invisible, that they we have always found ways to be together and to find love. And it often comes at a price. There's often sacrifice, there's often difficulty, but it's always been possible for people to find each other. And I remember when I was growing up and knew I was queer from a very young age, I thought I was the only queer person in the world. It was the 70s. And it wasn't really until I got out of college and moved to New York that I began to learn about queer history, discovered that a lot of the artists who I grew up loving, a lot of the people we had learned about in high school and college, writers, artists, were all themselves queer, but we had never been taught that. And I remember feeling stabilized by that discovery. I wasn't alone. I wasn't an island. I was part of a lineage. I was part of a family tree that I didn't know I was part of because it wasn't part of my biological family tree. And I hadn't known that you could trace a lineage for yourself that was outside of your biological family tree, that we could become parts of family trees that we are not born into. Andrew Sullivan writes about this in, which he wrote about much later, but it's a book called Far from the Tree, which is essentially this idea. And it's a really great book. So I did all of that consciously. And I guess the one other thing I would say is that one of the characters has a surgery on his chest that I had when I was a kid, and has asthma, which I had when I was a kid. So I was conscious because I don't know, I always think I make up all my characters, that I'm very inventive. And then very often when I finish the book, I realize that like everyone is me.
Right.
Like even when two characters really dislike each other and they're having some kind of philosophical argument, I often realize at the end of the book that those are the arguments I often have within myself. And I did a book called Big Tree, where about two sycamore seeds who are trying to save the world, and they're siblings, and one is very pragmatic and scientific and believes that you have to follow the rules, and his sister is very dreamy and very, poetic. And that one was a real shock to discover that that's my internal fight. Like that's me fighting with myself all the time. And so I think it wasn't until I finished Run Away with Me that I saw how the two boys in this book represent different aspects of myself, sort of a sort of an insecure version of myself at that age. This is not a true story. I did not have this experience when I was 16. I fell in love for the first time when I was 30. So I was imagining a feeling half a lifetime earlier. But falling in love is falling in love. And I imagine that those sensations exist in some form, whatever age we are when it first happens to us. I've had people tell me that they didn't fall in love for the first time until they were 60, and they recognize the emotions in this story.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Yeah. I love that you said that because there is something universal about the feelings that at least I, as a reader, had while reading this. It is, a love story between two distinct people at a very distinct time. But no matter your age, no matter your orientation, I would even say, no matter anything, like you just feel the intimacy of, what happens when two people allow themselves to see each other and to just have that sense of connection. It was just beautiful. It was so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember writing this the moment when the boys meet. I didn't write the story in order. I wrote very randomly because I didn't know what the plot was going to be. So I just started writing different scenes, and then I eventually put them into an order that seemed logical. And then I noticed what was missing between those scenes and then wrote those scenes. So I wrote the scene where the boys meet probably like the fifth or sixth scene that I wrote. I was like, oh, the boys are already like hanging out. I should write the scene where they meet. And it's told from the first person point of view of Danny, the American boy. And there is an introduction in this book that sets up the idea that this is a memory story, that an adult is looking back on his 16th summer and the time he first fell in love. And I remember writing the moment where the two boys have met, they're looking at each other, and Danny, the American boy, he describes this feeling of strangeness because the other boy is looking at him. Like this other person is, like you just said, is literally seeing him, and he had never really felt that before because of course he's not just seeing him there as a human person in the piazza that they're standing in. Of course, like everyone sighted sees him, his mom sees him, his teacher sees him, but he's keeping something secret. So that, and again, like this, and keeping secrets isn't just a queer
Right.
story, right? I think so many people have, maybe everybody has something that they keep to themselves. And even though it's not, maybe because it's not spoken in words, the American boy knows immediately that the Italian boy sees him, which, for now that I'm thinking about it, now that we're talking about it, means he sees all of him. He sees this other thing that he's been hiding, and it's suddenly not scary. It doesn't need to be spoken. It just is. And yeah, I can't, like, I didn't have a moment like that myself, that like that strong clarity, but I think the idea feels very present in me in different ways.
Yeah. And really, that's like all any of us want, right? Is to just be seen and accepted for exactly who we are standing in front of someone. And
Yeah.
and that is just that really is the beauty that I was walking away with, it is that intimacy of that kind of level that I think we're all after. But you said something now that makes me want to ask a follow-up question. Not in relation to that, but you said you write the scenes out of order, or at least for this book, you wrote them out of order. Where does the drawing fit in? Before, during, after, in between? Does it matter which book, which story?
So I never draw first. I always write. But I see everything in my mind even when I'm just writing. So I feel like I'm already translating from a picture to language. So I essentially go from what I see in my mind to writing text to describe it. And for, like for Hugo, when I got the idea to do the sequences of drawings, what I did was I took out the section of text I had already written, and then looked in my imagination at the pictures that I thought page by page could tell that part of the story or show that part of the story. And then for wonderstruck. I knew that one of the stories was going to be illustrated when I began, but I still had to figure out what the story was going to be. So I wrote the story in first person and in third. No, what's the one that's he or she or they? That's second person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote it in second person. There is a girl. She, it loves New York City. And then once I had her story down, I then, okay, how do I get across the idea that she loves New York City just in pictures? So then I thought, well, if I put her in New Jersey, she can look out her window and we can all see the skyline of New York. And then if she's drawing the skyline again and again and again, and we see the drawings and buildings all over her room, we can get the idea that there's, right. So then I'm figuring out what the drawings are going to be. For this book, because I thought there was going to be no pictures, I I was very concerned and interested in describing the places that the boys go. And when I was working, when David Levithan, my editor, and I uh, were figuring out what the opening sequence could be, and we had this idea to make this tour of the city. I thought, okay, what how can I present this tour so that it feels like something special, something magical, something dreamlike. And so it became a dream. And I think I already had the idea that at the beginning of the book, the main character was going to wake up in a church after having tried to escape from or get out of the rain. And so I thought, okay, so I'll make this walk through Rome from one place to another place, and the drawings will end in the church that he goes to, because it was a real, all the Roman places and most of the Roman stories that I tell in the book are true, and or based on something true. So I I mapped in my mind a real path through Rome based on my time in the city and the places I most loved. The story was being built around putting the boys in the places that I had learned about when I was in Rome that I really loved. And I just started like, okay, I'll start at the museum where the boy is living for the summer with his mom. We'll start there. And I know where and that's visually, it's based on the American Academy of Rome where David and I were living. But in the book, I've turned that building into the Monda Museum that's up in above an area called Trastevere. And so I then had, like the walk down through Trastevere across the Ponte Sisto, the bridge that connects uh, Trastevere to the rest of the city across the water. Then you go across the bridge. So that's an actual walk you could do. And it's not a straightforward walk. You have to sort of loop around a little bit, but it gets us to all of the places that I need you to see uh, before getting to the church. And it's a little tiny church, Santa Maria in Trivio, I believe is its name. If you want to go there, if you're heading to Rome, if you're standing at the Trevi Fountain, to the left, directly to the left of the Trevi Fountain is a street and a little tiny church with two wooden doors and four steps going upwards. And you can go inside. And I was sent there by my friend Charles Kreloff, who was the designer on many, many of my books. And he said, Brian, you have to go to this church. There are these like gay angels on the ceiling. Like they are like you can't believe they are real. They're from like the 1500s. So I had gone in, and sure enough, there are these shirtless angels sort of sitting, painted to like look trompe l'oeil, like they're sitting in the eaves above the windows, and they're looking at each other across the church. So it looks a little bit like they're catching each other's eye, like the artist had gone down to the docks and found a couple of young sailors and brought them back to his studio and sat them down and then put wings on them. And it's a very, very beautiful painted. The whole ceiling is gorgeous. In the center are Bible stories.
Wow.
And so I got us there to that church in the drawings.
Which your book has made me want to go to Rome and just stay for as long as I possibly can. Never been. It's on the
Uh,
bucket list. I feel
I hope
like
you
I'm
go.
going to travel a bit here with the book, but now like I need to see it. I need to see it in real life.
Oh, good. I hope you get there. You will. You will get there.
So,
And also, when you go, let me know because I can recommend some good recommend restaurants.
oh, perfect. Perfect. So, as you think about this book, going out in the world pretty recently, getting into readers' hands, what is your hope, either for the book or your hope for readers who are able to read it? I'd love to hear your thoughts before we wrap up today on that.
Yeah, the book was published into a world that I did not imagine it would be published into. Um, Things are, exponentially worse and harder than we imagined they would be, particularly for young queer people. And so right now, my hope is simply that the book finds its way into people's hands, into young people's hands. And I know that just doing that is is a challenge. And before the book was published, I did a pre-publication tour of conferences, and I was speaking about and giving the book away to teachers, librarians, and booksellers. And I was very, very heartened by the fact that when I went to the Texas Library Association convention, because I went to a lot of red states, I think 500 librarians lined up in Texas to get an early copy of this book. And I asked every single one of them how they were doing, how things were on the ground at their library. And several of them had me sign the book for their libraries, which I was very moved by. Some of them just knew someone that they wanted to give it to. So I know that getting the book into people's hands, young people's hands, is particularly challenging at this moment. But we have to keep ourselves safe. If our jobs are in danger, we have to think about how to keep our jobs safe, which may feel like doing things that compromise our integrity, but we have to think about that realistically. Like, people, we need our jobs. And some people can leave, some people will have to leave even though they don't want to. So safety and looking at your, actual situation is of utmost priority. But I was heartened by the idea that talking to so many teachers and librarians and booksellers, as I said, from all over the country, I went to bookstores on my tour in many, many red states and had, people come everywhere I went. There were at least some people who came, and it just made me think about the ways in which we have to be brave and stand up to the things that are scaring us and that are dangerous, and that we can find ways. If I guess what I should say is, if it's possible for you to find ways to get these books, and again, I'm really not just talking about mine. I'm talking about all the books that are under threat. And of course, it's not really the books that are under threat, it's the people the books are about that are under threat. So all of the young people who are under threat right now, whose lives are being made more difficult, more dangerous, who may feel more hopeless. In the best of times, there's places where it's hard to grow up and be yourself. But we do have to, as I said, we do have to think about our safety. And sometimes, I was on a panel with a trans person talking about books and safety, and they said something very powerful, which is sometimes it's okay to hide. It's okay to know inside who you are. That can't be taken away. But if your safety is at stake, and there are other real issues, because at some point you'll be able to get away. At some point, you'll be able to find a community that supports you and loves you in the way that is complete. And hopefully that will involve your family and eventually. Sometimes, that can be very challenging. It was, I had my challenges coming out to my family, but in the end, even my dad, who was, let's just say, very unhappy, Although he did make it clear he loved me, which I knew was made me very lucky. Even he came around, right? So that it does happen. So all of that to say that I hope that some people are able to find my book, that it possibly offers to someone else the kind of stability I got from learning about queer history that's in there. Ultimately, I really just hope you like the story, right? Like I hope you like and connect with the characters on whatever fashion, in whatever fashion that you may. And I hope that the people who find it and the people who are distributing it in whatever way they feel safe, are able to stay safe and stay strong in these very, very challenging times.
Well, I am very proud and honored to be part of your launch of putting it into the world. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to talk about it and just for writing and illustrating it and just sharing such a beautiful story.
Thank you. It's been really, really great talking to you, and it really means a lot.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all of the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. You'll also find KidLit Love on Substack. That's where you'll find posts for each episode, monthly KidLit roundups, and an invitation to join my summer book club and go deeper into the world of children's literature. And if you loved this podcast and want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.